I was cheated on by my fiancé and rejected by my family. Discover how I rebuilt my life from scratch. The worst feeling I've ever felt in my life was looking at someone I thought I knew body and soul and realizing it was all a lie. It wasn't a stumble. It wasn't a slip-up. It was a planned, repeated betrayal, sustained by apologies and false affection. I can't explain the physical pain it caused me. I was shaking. My mouth went dry. It felt like someone had ripped out my stomach. My head was spinning, and the worst part was, I couldn't cry. It was as if the pain had become trapped inside me. My heart felt like it was pounding in my neck, a tight grip that wouldn't release. There, at the exact moment I discovered that Diego, the man I was going to marry, was cheating on me, I understood that life as I knew it was over. There was no going back. It was as if I had died along with that relationship. My name is Camilla. I'm 29 years old, and until I was 27, I believed I was building the perfect life. A stable engagement, a wedding date, a seemingly united family, plans to buy an apartment. I was that person everyone said, "Wow, you're so lucky." Today, I laugh bitterly at that statement because it wasn't luck, it was blindness. I believed what I wanted to believe and ignored the signs. Not because I was stupid, but because I loved in a way that blinded me. The time it all happened was in 2023, right after my 27th birthday. I was in what should have been one of the happiest moments of my life, and suddenly I was thrown into a dark pit, with no light, no rope, and no one willing to lend a hand. I discovered the betrayal in such a humiliating way that I still feel ashamed when I remember it. It wasn't because I went through his phone. It wasn't because I suspected anything. It was because a friend showed me his profile on a dating app. It wasn't fake. It was him. Recent photos, disgusting conversations with other women. There was my fiancé, the man who claimed he loved me, offering himself like a teenager desperate for cheap attention. When I confronted him, he denied it. He swore, he cried, he said it was just a joke. With every word he said, my stomach churned. It wasn't a joke, it was disrespectful. It was betrayal. It was proof that he was never the man I believed. It was like I'd been stabbed in the chest, only the blade wouldn't stop turning. I thought I'd at least have my family's support. My mother, Selena, always said we were united, that family came before everything else. Well, when the bomb went off, the first person to rush to Diego's defense was her. I was paralyzed. The woman who was supposed to protect me looked at me as if I were guilty. She said I might have neglected the relationship, that men sometimes make mistakes, but that I should think carefully before ending it all. It hurt more than hearing his confession, because I hadn't expected Diego's betrayal, but my mother's. That destroyed me in a different way. I felt alone in the world. My father, Jorge, said nothing. He pretended not to hear, curled up on the couch. My sister, Lorena, crossed her arms and told me I should get over it, because marriage isn't a fairy tale. It was at that moment I realized I had no family. I only had people who shared the same last name. The anger I felt was so intense it gave me a headache, as if my mind was burning inside. I paced around the house, unable to breathe properly. I cried in the shower until I lost my voice. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. The worst part was the feeling of abandonment. I had nowhere to run, because the people who should have been on my side were against me. I thought, if even my mother chose his side, what's left for me? It was such a void that I wanted to disappear. There were days when I didn't get out of bed, when I just stared at the ceiling and wondered if I would ever have the strength to get up again. I saw no way out, no future, only darkness. The following days were a blur of decisions made impulsively and fearfully. I hurriedly left the house with a suitcase and went to the apartment of a friend, Natalia, the only one in that whirlwind who truly listened to me without judging. I remember the smell of the coffee she made for me at 3 a.m, the borrowed blanket I used as I shivered, the feeling of being in transition between what I was and what I could still be. It was there, on that couch, that I began to realize I would survive, not because anyone would guarantee it, but because I still had a tiny thread of my own will alive. I began to think about everything I'd shelved. Dreams, jobs, friendships I'd abandoned because I thought marriage would solve everything. I also began to notice my physical appearance, my pale skin, the deep circles under my eyes, my trembling hands when I reached for my cell phone. My body carried the weight of trauma, and my mind tried to justify the pain with 1,000 excuses. I. Angry at myself for letting things get this way. Angry at Diego for being a coward. Angry at Selena and Lorena for choosing sides. But mixed in with it all, something small and insistent emerged. The curiosity to know who I was outside of that context. This growing thread pulled me into small actions. Walking in the park, responding to a message I'd been ignoring, seeing a therapist. They weren't grand gestures, but they began to rebuild a foundation. The internal struggle was greater than the EI. External conflicts. At night, when the house fell silent, the whole would come. Thoughts looped. Was I insufficient? Didn't I notice? Did I deserve this? Guilt clung tooth and nail, and I found myself replaying old conversations, gestures, and ways of speaking. I even sought explanations that didn't exist just to spare my ego from facing the truth. And the truth was harsh. I'd been deceived. I sought professional support at Natalia's insistence. Therapy, a psychiatrist, exams. I learned that trauma dismantles old patterns and that rebuilding requires direct, daily, sometimes repetitive work. I had relapses, messages I shouldn't have opened, looks on the street that made me retreat. But I also had small victories. Sleeping through the night, going out without makeup, laughing again with a strong heart. These contrasts taught me that the process isn't linear. It's an up and down, a mosaic of days that gradually fit together. The revenge, because yes, there was a clear desire for justice, wasn't driven by blind hatred, but by a deep desire to regain control over my narrative. I didn't do anything scandalous, nothing that would make me ashamed later. By exposing his actions with evidence, intelligently and bluntly, I re-established boundaries and showed that the truth outweighs the comfortable versions he sold. I did this for myself, to regain my dignity, not to humiliate. Still, seeing his reaction, the desperation, the attempts at control, the messages demanding explanations, brought a quiet, adult satisfaction, as if I had cut a bond that was draining my energy. Society makes revenge seem childish. I saw how, in some cases, it can be a mechanism for recognizing one's own worth. Parallel to this, I returned to working diligently. I rediscovered hobbies, pottery classes, reading, walking through new neighborhoods. I took a short trip alone, my first since I was a teenager, and felt the pleasure of planning it without consulting anyone. I met new people, some superficial, others who became important confidants. Between mistakes and successes, I realized that rebuilding involves making practical choices, separating finances, changing routines, notifying friends and colleagues about what happened to cut down on gossip. None of this completely heals, but it creates new paths. There were days when I missed what I imagined I had. Not the betrayal, of course, but the possibilities I envisioned. I missed certain small rituals, dreaming aloud about decorating the apartment, the promise of a future with someone by my side. This grief is underestimated. Losing an image of the future is losing a part of your identity. I allowed myself to grieve over it. I performed a strange ritual of burning old notes, messages, and notes. Sometimes these gestures seem superficial, but they carried meaning. It was the acceptance that the project was over and that I needed to rethink it honestly. In practice, I rethought it. I started saving with realistic goals, went back to studying for a course I wanted, and strengthened my professional networks. Financial independence became one of my most important pillars. I didn't want to depend on anyone to validate my choices or rescue me. I reinforced boundaries with my family. I communicated that I didn't accept judgment and that for now I preferred distance. It was painful to cut ties, but necessary. I began to prioritize relationships that strengthened me. Natalia was there the whole time. Raphael, who appeared later, slowly, came like a breath of fresh air, unhurried, unpressured. He didn't come in to heal wounds. He came in to walk beside me, respecting the time I still needed. Rebuilding also came with public shame. There would always be those who knew the details. Mutual friends, neighbors, social media. I learned to deal with other people's judgment practically, responding when necessary, ignoring when possible. I started running in the morning, feeling my muscles awaken and my mind clear. Every little thing added up. Sleeping better, eating more mindfully, scheduling routine appointments. I still have bad days. I still remember his face, his voice. Sometimes anger arises without warning. But today, looking back, I see that I'm no longer the person who accepted everything for fear of loss. I'm rebuilding with my own rules. The relationship with my mother, Selena, was perhaps the deepest wound, because unlike Diego, I couldn't simply erase her from my life. For a long time, I felt the need to hear an apology, a word of recognition, anything that would prove she understood how much she'd hurt me. That request never came. On the contrary, she insisted that I should be more understanding, that nobody's perfect, that a marriage takes effort. Each word was like rubbing salt in an open wound. I had anxiety attacks after some conversations because it felt like my pain was invisible. Until one day, I hung up the phone in the middle of one of those conversations. And I didn't call back. I cut off contact. It was a hard decision, because I was raised believing that mothers are sacred. But I learned the hard way that blood doesn't guarantee respect, and that true love must be combined with empathy. This break still hurts, but it also freed me from a suffocating expectation. Today, I accept that we may never have full reconciliation, but at least I have my voice back. My sister, Lorena, followed a path of self-sabotage that nearly dragged me down with her. I discovered she was involved with a married man, and even though she saw the signs she was being used, she refused to listen. Instead of feeling compassion for me, she used my pain as an argument. See? Every man cheats. You only found out before the wedding. It was cruel to hear that. I tried to warn her, but I realized it wasn't my place to rescue her. The result was predictable: scandals, fights, public humiliation. For a long time, this situation haunted me because it seemed to reinforce my mother's narrative that women must swallow to save face. But I decided to walk away. It wasn't coldness, it was self-preservation. I could no longer live surrounded by people who normalized disrespect. And, over time, I realized that life demands choices from everyone. She faced her own consequences, and I didn't have to get dirty in the process. This separation was a form of silent healing, allowing each person to respond to what they sow. In the midst of all this confusion, I forced myself to revisit my own self-esteem story. When I realized I was accepting crumbs of love, I realized the problem didn't start with Diego. It started with me, with the times I kept quiet, when I let small, disrespectful remarks slide, when I prioritized what the other person wanted instead of setting my own boundaries. It was hard to acknowledge this because I didn't want to further blame myself, but it was also liberating. I couldn't change the past, but I could change my future choices. I started writing daily, like a diary of venting. I noted fears, but also achievements, even the smallest ones. Today I went out alone and didn't cry. Today I looked in the mirror and liked what I saw. Today I said no and didn't regret it. This habit gave me clarity. Over time, reading through the old pages, I realized how much I was evolving, even when it seemed like I wasn't moving forward. This exercise in raw honesty with myself became one of the most powerful tools in my recovery. Natalia's presence throughout this process was crucial, not just as a friend, but as a witness that I still had value. She reminded me that true friendship doesn't need long explanations, that showing up with a pizza and a shoulder to cry on through a night of tears is enough. I was afraid of overwhelming her, but she always said, "You're not alone. I can handle you." That phrase stuck with me. Thanks to her, I accepted help in other areas as well. I asked for more support at work, spoke more openly about my situation when someone tried to silence me with gossip. This made me realize that courage is contagious. A network forms the moment we shamelessly expose the truth. Sure, some people walked away, but those who stayed became even more precious. I learned that to rebuild, you also need to recognize who deserves to be around and who is just there to drain. When Rafael came into my life, I had already decided I didn't need a relationship to complete me. And perhaps that's precisely why it worked. He appeared discreetly, respected my time, and never pressured me to open up too quickly. At first, I felt stuck, suspicious, ready to run at the slightest hint of a lie. But he didn't try to fill any gaps with promises. He was simply present. Walks, long conversations, silly laughs, small gestures that showed me that love doesn't need to come packaged in speeches, but in consistency. It was strange to realize that, after so much time feeling pain, I could still laugh at simple things. I wouldn't say he saved me, because I was already saving myself, but he brought lightness to a process that had been heavy until then. And he showed me that, yes, it is possible to rebuild trust, even if it's step by step at first. Therapy made me face uncomfortable truths. One of them was recognizing the anger I felt toward myself for having believed so much in Diego. I constantly judged myself, repeating in my mind, "How did I not notice?" The psychologist helped me understand that manipulation is a trap precisely because it builds in small doses. It's like a web you don't see until you're already trapped. This understanding brought enormous relief because it lifted the weight of eternal guilt from me. I wasn't stupid. I was deceived. And being deceived doesn't define who I am. Gradually, I replaced cruel self-criticism with self-compassion. I began to talk to myself the way I would talk to a friend, with patience, with acceptance. This internal dialogue changed the way I face bad days, because they still exist, but now I don't wallow in them like I used to. Today, I know how to get back up more quickly. Another important part of my reconstruction was taking care of my body, not just for aesthetic reasons, but because I felt it had stored traumas. I had insomnia, nervous gastritis, and migraines. Little by little, I created new routines, light exercise, a more balanced diet, guided meditation. At first, it seemed like a waste of time, but I realized that when the body responds better, the mind also gains strength. I started sleeping more, waking up without that heavy feeling in my chest. The first day I woke up wanting to get up, without dragging my body, was like a silent victory. I learned that the body is our first ally or enemy, depending on how we treat it. And in my case, taking care of it was part of reclaiming my identity. Today, running or simply walking is a reminder that I'm alive, present, and capable of starting over. This physical reconnection gave me a sense of power I thought I'd lost. Emotionally, triggers still test me. When I see couples posting happy photos, I sometimes feel a pang in my stomach. At family gatherings, I still notice sidelong glances and snide comments. I've heard people say, "I overreacted," or "I should have tried harder." These things still hurt, but I've learned to put up barriers. I don't need to explain myself to everyone. I don't need to convince anyone of what I've experienced. The truth is within me, and that's enough. Of course, some days everything comes back as if it were yesterday. The humiliation, the loneliness, the anger. But now I know these are memories, not my current reality. In those moments, I take deep breaths, write in my journal, or run until my body tires. This is how I transform what could bring me down into fuel to keep going. And, as much as it hurts to admit, I realize that these triggers also remind me of the strength I've gained. The greatest lesson from this process is that starting over isn't about erasing the past, but learning to live with it without letting it define me. I still carry scars, and probably always will. But they aren't marks of defeat. They're proof of survival. Today, I no longer seek perfection. I seek authenticity. I want relationships, whether romantic, family, or friendship, that truly respect me. I want to look in the mirror and know that I haven't abandoned myself again. I still don't have all the answers. I still face days when the pain throbs, but I know I'm not the same anymore. I've stepped out of the victim role and embraced the role of author of my life. If before I lived in fear of displeasing others, today I live with the certainty that my peace is a priority. And in the end, this is perhaps the greatest victory, being reborn without chains, free to choose my path. I have zero contact with Diego these days, not because I don't feel angry. I do, sometimes more than ever. But because I've learned I don't need him to validate my life. I ignore his messages, block his social media, and maintain physical and emotional distance. Each decision not to respond, not to back down, is a silent victory that no one sees, but which strengthens me. I've discovered that freedom comes in small doses. A firm no, a smile that doesn't need approval, a guilt-free walk alone. I still remember his scent, the way he lied while looking into my eyes, and sometimes it makes me shiver. But today, these details don't define me. They're just chapters in a book I've rewritten. By keeping my distance, I protect my space, my peace, and above all, my heart. It's curious to see how the power of walking away can be more transformative than any external revenge. It's a silent power, but one that erodes the other's need to still try to manipulate you. My relationship with Lorena and my mother remains distant, and honestly, I don't know if we'll ever be close again. I tried, at first, with small attempts at rapprochement, neutral messages, discreet invitations. There was always a tone of judgment or manipulation. It was then that I understood that some relationships are beyond repair. Accepting this was liberating and painful at the same time. I learned that cutting ties isn't a sign of failure, but of self-love. Maintaining toxic bonds only prolongs the pain. Today, I can think of them with less anger and more detachment. Does it still hurt? Yes, but it's a pain that doesn't immobilize me. It's different. Now, when I think of them, I remember the lessons. Realizing that family doesn't always mean security, that protecting yourself is a priority, and that life is too short to live trapped in resentment. This awareness gave me the serenity to focus on those who truly deserve to be by my side. Love returned, but in a different way. With Raphael, I learned that it's possible to love someone without losing your own identity. We talked, laughed, and fought, but always with respect and honesty. No lies or manipulative games. He didn't come to fill voids. He came to walk with me. I still have scars, but I don't let them define my relationships. Every step in the relationship is conscious, and every mistake I make is a learning experience. Healthy love is discreet, patient, and secure. I learned that happiness isn't momentary intensity, but consistency and respect. And most importantly, I learned that before loving someone, you need to love yourself. Emotional reconstruction taught me this in a painful but necessary way. Today, when I wake up and see him smiling, I feel grateful for having been able to pick myself up and be open to what's good, without fear or guilt. Traveling alone was also a milestone. I felt the fear of the unknown, the insecurity of being far from everything I knew. But it was liberating. Discovering places, talking to strangers, getting lost on unfamiliar streets, all of this taught me that I can trust myself. Every decision I made alone, every restaurant choice, every route without a map gave me back a sense of autonomy. I felt the pleasure of feeling alive again. I learned that starting over doesn't mean erasing memories, but creating new experiences that overcome past pain. And that's how I realized. Life goes on, and it's up to me to decide whether it will be filled with bitterness or the desire to live fully. I chose the latter. Today, looking back, I see a Camilla I wouldn't have recognized 2 years ago. Stronger, more confident, aware of her worth. I forgave, not for them, but for myself. I forgave the past, not to go back, but to no longer carry unnecessary weight. I know there are still difficult days, that some scars will never completely disappear, but I am alive and free to build my story without the chains of the past. Family chaos taught me that emotional independence is fundamental and that self-love is not optional. Life gave me a second chance to write my story, and I'm enjoying every line. I learned that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, and that, even when everything seems to be falling apart, it is possible to be reborn, stronger, more aware, and ready to live without fear.